Welcome to Kat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello, I'm your host, Kat. Okay, so I've been putting this one off for a little, not because it isn't important, but because it's one of those cases that's been told so many times and not always carefully. So today we're going to slow it down a little bit. It's the morning of January 15th, 1947. Los Angeles is waking up the way it always does. Slowly, casually, like nothing unusual could possibly interrupt it. A woman named Betty Bersinger is out walking with her young daughter in a quiet neighborhood near Leimert Park. It's a residential area, modest houses, empty lots, the kind of place where nothing ever really happens. As they walk, Betty notices something in the grass of a vacant lot. At first, she assumes it's a mannequin. Guys, it's never a mannequin. It looks pale, still, almost staged. And that assumption makes sense. Discarded mannequins weren't uncommon in Los Angeles at the time, especially near studios and department stores. But still, guys, it's never mannequins. As she gets closer, something feels wrong. The shape is too real, too deliberate, and too human. And then she realizes this is not a mannequin at all. It's a body. The woman is lying in the grass, completely still, her skin naturally pale against the dark earth. Her posture is strange. Not collapsed, not twisted, but placed. Betty immediately grabs her daughter and runs to the nearest house to call the police. Within minutes, officers arrive at the scene. And what they find is something none of them will ever forget. The body belongs to a young woman. She has been posed deliberately. There are no signs of a struggle in the surrounding area, no footprints running away, no evidence of chaos. Whatever happened here did not happen suddenly, and it also didn't happen right there. This wasn't a crime of panic, it was a crime of control. As word spreads through the police department, something else happens, something that will shape the entire future of this case. The press arrives. Photographers, reporters, headlines already forming before anyone knows her name. Before investigators can fully process what they're looking at, the story begins to move faster than the evidence. By the end of the day, newspapers across Los Angeles are running the same image. The same framing, the same language, and somewhere in the rush to publish, to label, to captivate readers, the victim is given a name that will follow her forever. The Black Dahlia. A name that sounds dramatic, mysterious, almost cinematic. But at that moment, lying in a vacant lot before the city ever knew who she wasn't a symbol. She was just a woman who hadn't been identified yet. And the tragedy of this case is that she never really got the chance to be known again. This is the case of the Black Dahlia. Before she was ever called the Black Dahlia, her name was Elizabeth Short. And that distinction matters because once the nickname arrived, it swallowed almost everything else. Elizabeth was born in Massachusetts in 1924, one of 5 daughters. Her childhood wasn't particularly glamorous or tragic in the way the headlines like to frame it, but it was unstable. Her father disappeared when she was young, later revealed to have faked his own death, which once I learned this, I had to do a little deep dive on this. So Elizabeth Short's father was named Cleo Short. In 1930, when Elizabeth was just 6 years old, Cleo disappeared. His car was found abandoned on a bridge in Massachusetts, a detail that strongly suggested suicide. The family believed he was dead. His wife was left to raise 5 daughters alone during the Great Depression. For years, Elizabeth grew up thinking her father had taken his own life. And then years later, the truth surfaced. Cleo Short was not dead at all. He had faked his death and fled. Eventually resurfacing in California, he contacted Elizabeth when she was a teenager, reintroducing himself into her life after more than a decade of absence. And that revelation mattered, because it meant that Elizabeth didn't grow up with loss, she grew up with abandonment reframed as choice. So the reason they think he did this was because Cleo Short's business failed during the Great Depression, so he was under severe financial pressure, facing debt, and the inability to support his family. So that's kind of why they think he left. But back to Elizabeth's story. Elizabeth's mother raised the girls largely on her own. Elizabeth was sick for much of her childhood. Chronic asthma kept her in and out of hospitals. And for long stretches of time, her life revolved around recovery. It meant she was often separated from friends, routines, and any real sense of consistency. By the time she was a teenager, Elizabeth was restless. She moved frequently, she stayed with friends, relatives, acquaintances. She bounced between cities, Florida, California, she went back east, rarely settling in one place for long. Not because she was running from something specific, but because she was searching. Los Angeles especially represented possibility. Hollywood in the 1940s was a magnet for young women who believed, or hoped, that something bigger was waiting for them. Elizabeth was one of many who arrived with vague ambitions and very few protections. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to belong somewhere. She wanted more than the narrow options available to her. But the reality of the world was harsher than the image it sold. Elizabeth didn't have steady work. She relied on the kindness and sometimes the expectations of others. She stayed in temporary housing, short-term arrangements, places that were easy to leave and just as easy to be forgotten. Friends described her as polite, soft-spoken, and careful. She wasn't reckless in the way later narratives suggested. She didn't drink heavily, she didn't have a criminal record, she wasn't known to be violent or volatile, but she was vulnerable. And vulnerability doesn't look dramatic, it's quiet. It looks like someone who doesn't quite have a safety net. One of the cruelest parts of this case is how quickly Elizabeth was flattened into a stereotype after her death. The fallen woman, the aspiring actress, the girl chasing fame at any cost. But those labels say more about the era than about her herself. Elizabeth wasn't famous. She wasn't powerful. She wasn't even particularly visible. She was someone drifting through a city that excelled at overlooking people just like her. And when she died, the story that emerged didn't ask who she was. It asked what she represented. The press focused on her appearance, her clothes, her rumored relationships. They speculated freely and often inaccurately. They filled in gaps with imagination and implication. She didn't get to control the narrative. The city did. By the time the investigators officially identified her, the name Elizabeth Short was already slipping away, replaced by something darker, catchier, easier to print. To understand how Elizabeth Short disappeared into a myth so quickly, you have to understand the city she was living in. This was Los Angeles in the mid-1940s, a city freshly intoxicated by itself. Hollywood was booming. Studios were churning out stars, stories, and dreams at an industrial scale. The image of success was everywhere. Billboards, movie posters, glossy magazines stacked in drugstores. But the truth was quieter. For every person who, quote-unquote, made it, there were thousands who didn't. Thousands of people drifting through boarding houses, cheap hotels, and spare rooms, trying to stay visible in a city that rewarded only the loudest success stories. The press didn't approach the story cautiously. They didn't wait for facts to settle. They leaned into the spectacle immediately. Newspapers competed aggressively for attention. The more shocking the headline, the better the circulation. In Elizabeth's death, brutal, mysterious, visually arresting, offered something they couldn't resist. A story that felt cinematic. The Black Dahlia wasn't just a murder investigation, it was a performance. Evidence was compromised, leads were polluted, the line between fact and fiction blurred almost immediately. Up until this point, Elizabeth Short is alive. After this, everything we know becomes reconstruction. The last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short was on the evening of January 9th, 1947, at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She was sitting alone in the lobby, appearing calm, unhurried, and dressed neatly. Several witnesses later said she looked like she was waiting for someone, though no one could say who. This is important because it's the last moment in her life that investigators can place with certainty. After that night, there are no verified sightings. So what did they think she was doing? Elizabeth didn't have a permanent address. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had been staying with friends, acquaintances, and occasionally short-term rentals. She moved frequently because she didn't have stable housing. Police believed she was meeting people socially, relying on acquaintances for temporary lodging, or possibly arranging to stay with someone new that night. There is no evidence she was involved in criminal activity, sex work, or anything illegal, despite how the media later portrayed her. What investigators could say was this: She trusted someone enough to leave the Biltmore with them. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a woman walking with her child through a vacant lot in Leimert Park, so this is kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning, she noticed what she initially thought was a discarded mannequin. It's never a mannequin. When she looked closer, she realized it was a human body. Elizabeth Short's body had been placed deliberately in the open lot, fully visible from the street. The autopsy revealed that Elizabeth's body had been bisected cleanly at the waist, meaning she was cut in half, using a precise surgical technique known as a hemicorporectomy. This cut was so exact that it suggested medical or surgical knowledge or someone who had studied anatomy closely. Her body had been completely drained of blood, meaning the death occurred prior to the placement at that scene. The official cause of death was hemorrhaging and shock resulting from multiple injuries. The injuries documented were extensive and intentional. Deep cuts to the corners of her mouth, extending to her ears, later sensationalized as a Glasgow smile, so almost like the Joker, like where it's like cut all the way back. Bruising and trauma indicated that she had been restrained, and signs of prolonged physical abuse prior to death. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms. So importantly, the autopsy found no evidence of sexual assault, despite widespread claims in the newspapers at that time. She was washed, carefully posed, and arranged with precision. It wasn't concealment, it was display. Whoever killed Elizabeth Short did not try to hide what they'd done. They wanted her to be found, and they wanted the world to see it. So why was her body cut in half? The investigators have a few theories as to why they think this was done, none being like symbolic in a ritual sense. So one just being practical, so like disposal of the body and transporting it. This is the most widely accepted explanation, just logistical. It would have been easier to transport her body, especially if the killer was working alone, using a small vehicle, or moving the body from an indoor location. There were no drag marks at the scene, and the placement appeared deliberate and controlled. Dividing the body would have reduced weight and bulk during transport. The second theory as to why she could have been cut in half, it is a technique taught in the medical setting at the time, but an important clarification would be that it doesn't mean the killer had to be a surgeon, but it does suggest anatomical familiarity, confidence cutting through soft tissue and bone, and access to like appropriate tools to be able to do that. So they just believe that the killer was comfortable with these things, they were methodical, and they clearly weren't like panicking during the act because they had time to do this. And then the third reason that they potentially think that she was cut was for staging and psychological dominance. So not really ritualistic, but investigators did believe the killer was making a statement, not just like symbolic. It made the body obviously like visually shocking. It ensured immediate media attention, and it kind of stripped Elizabeth of her personhood in the public eye. And this also aligns with like the broader staging of like her body being washed, kind of placed out in the open, she was posed, that sort of thing. So investigators did not believe, I think it's just as important to say this clearly, there was no evidence of like occult ritual, no evidence it was done to remove organs or something like that surgically. There's no evidence of sexual motive ties, and there's no evidence that the cut is what caused her death. They believed death had already occurred and was inevitable due to other injuries. So like I said, it's important to note they thought that she was probably already dead when that occurred. And according to the autopsy, Elizabeth Short died from a combination of severe head and facial trauma, hemorrhaging, and shock. So in plain terms, she was injured badly enough that her body went into shock and bled out, and that was what caused her death. And then the cutting happened later. Importantly, police were careful, even at the time, not to speculate publicly about motive. What they could say with certainty was this: it was a planned killing. The person responsible had control over Elizabeth, control over their environment, and enough time to carry out what they did without interruption. And then instead of hiding the body, they placed it where it would definitely be found. And that choice mattered. Because this wasn't a murder that could be explained away quietly. From the moment her body was discovered, investigators knew they were dealing with something deliberate, calculated, and deeply disturbing, even before the press turned it into a spectacle. And once those details became public, the case stopped being just an investigation and it became a fixation. Police could establish some basic facts about Elizabeth's final days. She had been seen in Los Angeles shortly before her death. She had made contact with people. She moved through familiar spaces. But the exact timeline, who she was with, where she went, how she ended up alone, remains frustratingly incomplete. And into that silence rushed speculation. The investigation itself struggled under the weight of public attention. People were eager for notoriety inserting themselves into this story. Each lead required time, each confession had to be ruled out, and as resources were spread thinner and thinner, focus fractured. And this is where the case kind of began to slip. As time passed, opportunities closed, witnesses disappeared, and memories faded. What remained was a crime frozen in the most sensational moment, endlessly replayed, rarely resolved. Newspapers published private details that never should have been public. They contacted family members. They printed information that compromised the investigation. In some cases, reporters reached leads before police did and published them anyways. The results were chaos. Tips flooded in, many inspired by headlines rather than reality. Suspects were not evaluated quietly. They were debated publicly. Evidence wasn't weighed carefully. The press wanted a villain. The public wanted answers, and the police needed more time. So by the time the Black Dahlia case reached its peak, investigators weren't just chasing one suspect. They were chasing dozens. Over the decades, more than 50 people have been publicly named, accused, or seriously investigated in connection with Elizabeth Short's murder. Hundreds more inserted themselves into the story through false confessions. So instead of listing every name that's ever been floated, which doesn't bring us closer to the truth, we're going to focus on the few suspects who continue to surface in serious conversations. What's important to understand also is that most of these cases, the connection to Elizabeth wasn't personal. It was circumstantial. Proximity, opportunity, maybe shared spaces. Very few suspects could be definitively placed in her life. So suspect number one, if you've ever heard of one name consistently tied to the Black Dahlia case, it's George Hodel. Hodel was a physician, wealthy, intelligent, well-connected. He lived in Los Angeles and had the kind of medical knowledge that made people uncomfortable when paired with the nature of the crime. Police suspected him early on. In fact, LAPD placed wiretaps in his home, a rare and serious step at the time. On those recordings, Hodel made comments that many later interpreted as incriminating, including remarks that suggested he believed he could not be convicted. Decades later, Hodel's own son publicly accused him of being the killer, citing family history, police files, and circumstantial evidence. On paper, it is compelling. Hodel had opportunity, he had knowledge, he had proximity, and he had police attention. There's no confirmed evidence that George Hodel and Elizabeth Short knew each other personally, though. What ties them together is geography and access, not relationships. Hodel lived in Los Angeles, not far from where Elizabeth was last seen. He moved in elite social circles, the kind that overlapped with transient housing, parties, and people passing through Hollywood at the time. In other words, if Elizabeth crossed his path, it wouldn't have been unusual, but it also wouldn't have been documented. And none of the evidence against Hodel is definitive. The wiretap recordings are vague, the interpretations are, they vary, and much of the case against him relies on reconstruction, not proof. Some experts believe he was capable. Others believe the case against him had been overstated and shaped by hindsight and confirmation bias. Hodel fits the idea of a killer in the case, but the line between suspicious and certainty was never crossed. So suspect number 2 was Leslie Dillon. He enters the story in a very different way. Dillon was not a doctor, he was not wealthy, he was not powerful. What drew attention to him were his words. Dillon had written letters and made statements that disturbed people. Graphic descriptions, violent ideations, and a fixation on crimes involving women. At one point, he corresponded with someone who implied involvement in Elizabeth's murder. Police took him seriously. They questioned him extensively. Psychologists became involved, and the case against him leaned heavily on behavioral analysis rather than any physical evidence. And this is where things kind of went wrong. The investigation into Dillon was mishandled. There was jurisdiction confusion, procedural errors, and internal conflicts within LAPD that undermined the case before it could solidify. There was no direct link between Dillon and Elizabeth, no proof he had ever met her, no physical evidence tying him to the crime. There were no shared circles, no documents overlapping. So really what Dillon represents isn't a strong suspect, it's a moment of desperation. When pressure mounts and answers don't appear, the investigation sometimes chase psychology instead of evidence. And that doesn't hold up in court. So suspect 3 was Mark Hansen. He's often discussed in this case because he was one who knew Elizabeth. He owned the property where she had stayed before. He was part of her social orbit. His name appeared in conversations about her final days. Their connection wasn't a secret, and that visibility is exactly why suspicion followed him so closely. But knowing someone, even housing them, is not evidence of violence. And in this case, there's no physical proof that ever tied Hansen to the crime itself. But proximity is powerful. It creates suspicion easily, sometimes too easily. Hansen was questioned, his connections were examined, his name appeared in media speculation repeatedly. But suspicion based on familiarity is not evidence. There was no proof that ever placed him at the scene, no physical evidence that tied him to the murder, and much of the case against him emerged from rumors, assumptions, and the public's need for a face attached to the crime. Hansen's story highlights one of the most uncomfortable truths of this true crime story. Being close to a victim can be enough to make you guilty in the public image, even when the evidence does not support it. So why is this still not resolved if we have these suspects? Every suspect in this case eventually collapses under scrutiny. Not because they were innocent, we don't know that for sure, but because the investigation never had the clarity, containment, or quiet it needed to reach certainty. The case was very loud from the beginning. The public was there, it was sensationalized, and everything kind of blurred together. Evidence has degraded, memories have shifted, and the timeline's blurry. Once that happens, justice becomes almost impossible. What's striking about the Black Dahlia case isn't how many suspects there were, it's how none of them could be held. Because by the time investigators tried to narrow the focus, the truth had already been drowned out. So this is the part where I try to tie things up in a nice little bow. But with this case, tying it up neatly would feel dishonest. Because the Black Dahlia isn't just an unsolved murder. It's an example of what happens when a story becomes bigger than the truth it's built on. So the media really took a toll on this case. So instead of answers, I have questions, like usual. So what happens when a victim becomes a symbol before they're fully understood? Or if a person is reduced to a nickname that sounds more like a movie title? Did the spectacle of this case protect the killer by overwhelming the investigation with too much noise? Because sometimes attention does not illuminate the truth. Why do we keep returning to this story? Is it the brutality? Is it the mystery? Is it just the era they were in? Or is it something more uncomfortable? The idea that someone could be so thoroughly consumed by a system and still never receive justice. Elizabeth Short didn't get to control how she was remembered. She didn't get to be complicated. Instead, she was flattened into an image, a symbol of danger, glamour, and mystery, while the actual person underneath disappeared. It asks us whether we're interested in understanding what actually happened or just consuming what the media tells us. Whether we want justice or a story that never ends. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. After decades of investigation, speculation, and obsession, the loudest thing left behind isn't the truth, it's the myth. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If this episode made you pause or rethink how we tell stories like this, follow the show and maybe someone else will like it too. New episodes drop every Wednesday. Shoot me an email or DM me on Instagram if you have any good stories for me. Until next time, maybe the most important questions aren't the ones we can answer, but the ones we're still responsible for asking. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.